and welcome back to our channel. On this channel, we discuss mental health with a special focus on how it affects us as a DID system. My name is Shell and I am the host of the system, and apologies in advance for any construction noises going on. I'm pretty sure that there will be construction at my apartment complex for all of eternity, so I don't think that I'm really going to be able to film without construction noises in the background, so apologies for that. So something that I've been dealing with for the past few weeks is denial about the DID diagnosis. And that my denial really started spiraling earlier this week. And luckily I was able to get out of that, and I'm accepting the diagnosis mostly now. But I wanted to talk about a couple of things that contributed to my denial about the disorder. So one of the things that I have a hard time with is the ease with which I got the diagnosis. And some of the other ultras in the system kind of roll their eyes at this because we have been in therapy since we were 21 and did not get diagnosed with DID until we were 36. So we were actually in therapy for a very long time before the diagnosis, so it's kind of like no, you didn't get the diagnosis very easily. But it's when the system cracked that my process for getting diagnosed went fairly quickly. When the system cracked, I went to my therapist, and I was pretty well versed in psychology. That is my special interest. I owned a copy of the DSM, so I knew most things about most disorders, and I was aware of the fact that hearing voices that I knew I hadn't created, because prior to Ricky, the voices I heard, I thought they were my imaginary friends, but Ricky I definitely did not create. And so I went to my therapist and I was like, I know that this is going to be either DID or schizophrenia, and I don't think it's schizophrenia. It's really funny because I was one of those people that would look at mental illnesses in the DSM and be like, that kind of sounds like me, but DID was never one of them. I was like, if there's one thing I definitely know I don't have, it's DID. And then when I was stumbling across DID creators when I was researching maladaptive daydreaming, and now I know that Cameron was actually kind of leading us down that rabbit hole. I started watching DID creators and I was like, wow, that sounds really difficult to live with. I'm so glad I don't have that. So when I went to my therapist, saying this kind of combined with everything else that has been going on, this kind of feels like DID, but I really don't want it to be DID. But I went to my therapist. She was like, let's consult with your psychiatrist. Went to my psychiatrist. She was like, yeah, that does sound like DID. And it was just the universe stepping in, because when we went to look for a specialist, because my therapist didn't have any background with dissociative disorders, one of the therapists in our areas actually reached out to her and was saying, if you have any patients with severe trauma, I do have a few openings, so reach out to me. So we immediately reached out to him and he took me on, and after a few sessions, he was like, yes, you have DID. He didn't put the diagnosis on paper because in his view, the system was what was actually helping me function versus being dysfunction, and you need to be dysfunctional for the DID to actually be a disorder. And then it would be when I saw my second therapist after moving that she would realize that no, actually the symptoms of the DID are causing distress. So yes, I have DID. And it's just, you hear about how difficult it is to get diagnosed and how you have to go through all these tests. And I have just been really lucky to work with DID specialists once I discovered the system. And so I feel like my process has been too easy for me to really have DID, which is kind of silly when I really should just be I'm really lucky and I'm thankful that my process was as smooth as it was. Now, another thing that happened as I got to know the diagnosis is when the system first cracked, I thought there was 5 of us. The only ones that I knew about were Cameron, Megumi, Mary, and Ricky. And then including myself, I figured that's all there was. And then Veronica introduced herself. And then slowly other alters started introducing themselves, and I'm still getting alters introducing themselves, like Cassidy, Cassie, and Darby all introduced themselves only within the past few months. And it just seems like weird that I thought I was such a small system, and now I just keep finding out about more alters, and also because of stressful situations, we've split a few times since then as well. And so that makes it feel like maybe it's not really DID, and maybe I'm like somehow creating it in my brain accidentally. But from hearing about other people, it does sound like it generally the process goes from knowing about a few alters, and then slowly your awareness grows about other alters. It would actually be more concerning if I like went from like 5 and then woke up and suddenly had 50. Like that would be more cause for concern. Not only because like that could be a sign that maybe DID isn't what you're looking at, but also if it is DID, then that means there was like a major amnesic barrier that broke down, and you should probably talk to somebody about that, because that can cause some distress. So those are things that like I myself have thought like, oh, this is kind of weird, so maybe I don't have DID. There's other things that get put out online by fake claimers, people with a more traditional manifestation of DID, certain professionals who have a very limited knowledge on what DID looks like. And so I'm just going to go through some of the things that I've heard that I feel like has contributed to my denial for the DID. So one thing that you hear about a lot is, and I know I've mentioned it myself in the past, and that's that like online, there tends to be a big emphasis on the alters and how different alters are. And in all actuality, this can be counterproductive to healing, because it creates more separation between alters when the goal for DID is integration, whether that integration looks like fusion or functional multiplicity. It's both integration. And so by focusing on the differences, it can actually cause more separation and make it more difficult to function as a system. Now, having said that, there are creators who, you know, it's just whoever happens to be in front, that's who makes the video. And that's what happens with us. Whoever is making the video is just whoever happens to be in front. Sometimes it means that videos that alters want to make don't get made for like months because they don't front to be able to make those videos. Sometimes somebody will come up with the idea and another alter will actually do the video because they're fronting and they can speak on the topic. What we do is, because we don't have the time or resources to have every alter dress the way that they would want to dress and the way that they would view themselves in the inner world. But what we use instead is on TikTok, we will use filters that make the alters more comfortable with their appearance on camera. And, you know, we've heard some systems say like that is glamorizing the DID, or that it's putting too much emphasis on the alters. But for us, and that didn't cause me so much to question if I was faking it, but if I was doing DID content correctly. But for us, and it's V is the one that kind of pointed it out, it's these filters do make the alters feel more comfortable. I use like a basic makeup filter, but some of the other alters will use filters to change our eye color, our hair color, maybe the way the makeup is done. And that's just because they feel more comfortable with those filters than staring into the camera and seeing my face when that's not what they see themselves as looking like. So when it comes to filters, we do that for the comfort of the alter that's filming the video. Another thing that you'll hear is just like anybody who is talking about DID on social media is faking it, because if you have DID, then you're so ashamed of it that there's no way you would talk about it online. And that just isn't true. Like, we know that there are systems that are officially diagnosed that make content because they're trying to educate about DID. And for us, it's become kind of a way for us to, one, we don't really have people to talk to about our life with DID. We kind of feel like we talk too much about DID with our friends and they get sick of us. So we use social media as a way of being able to talk about it. It's also a way for different alters to be able to express themselves. And even though, yes, I am ashamed of the DID, I'm ashamed of the switches. I don't like switching in front of people. So sometimes when we catch switches on camera, it can be really like, the others kind of have to convince me to let that get posted. With the shame also comes this desire to be seen, I guess, in that like the shame is because of the stigma, right? And so I want to decrease the stigma so that less of us have to feel ashamed of having a disorder that we had no say in developing and is actually a huge sign of the brain's ability to survive. And that's something that we should be proud of ourselves for surviving and proud of ourselves for coming up with a way to cope rather than being ashamed of things that we had no control over. Another thing that I sometimes have an issue with is the fact that we don't always know who's in front. And I've actually had somebody in my comments fake claim me because we had an alter who wasn't very clear on who she was at the time. Somebody else was very close to the front and she kept confusing herself with them. And they were like, that doesn't happen in real DID. But when I brought this up with my therapist, she was like, actually, that's pretty common with people with DID. And as I talk to other systems, I find that, yeah, a lot of systems spend a lot of time in some kind of blended form of alters. It's not like a pure manifestation of one alter. A lot of times there will be like several alters near the front, and it can make it very hard to determine who's actually the one fronting. And then when you throw in passive influence, it can be hard to say whether the decisions you're making are your decisions or if they're the decisions of another alter working through you. Another thing that can sometimes make it difficult to determine who's fronting is we aren't that differentiated, like when it comes to who we are as alters. Like we have our own names, we have our ages, we have the way that we appear in the inner world, we have our own interests and things, but the way that we present to the outside world, like we got diagnosed at 36, right? So we have spent more time masking than unmasking, and it's actually really hard for us to unmask. And so most alters will just default to this sort of persona that we have created as like, this is our single lit persona. This is what, if we were one person, this is how we think we would look. And so everybody kind of falls into that mask. And so it can make it hard to differentiate between alters, especially if other alters are making videos and they're masking, and I go back and I watch them and I'm like, that sounds like me and it looks like me, but I'm not the one that made that video. And it can be really hard when you're seeing online all these other systems that like they have different accents, their tone of voice changes, you know, they put on different clothing, they do their makeup differently, and they do so much to differentiate the alters that, like, looking at it from my perspective, it's kind of like, well, we're not that different, like we're not that easy to tell. Like if there's some alters that, like some of our friends and family, that when they're fronting and unmasking that they know, but even with friends and family that know we have DID, we still mask and they have no idea when we switch. And while that is very typical of covert systems, and covert systems make up the majority of the DID population, that's not what you see on social media because it's not as interesting, right? Like, what would you rather watch? Somebody who says that they are a different alter, but they look exactly the same as the person that you saw before, they sound exactly the same? Or would you rather see somebody whose alters are like, oh, one minute they sound like this, another minute they have an Australian accent and a high voice, the next it's a British accent and their voice is very low? Like, that just is more interesting to the general public. And so that's what you see more in social media. So it makes it look like that's what the majority of DID is, when really it is typically a lot more covert than that. Does not mean that if you are an overt system that you aren't valid. That's a totally valid expression of DID. It's just not what the majority of people with DID experience. Another thing that we hear a lot that makes me question the DID diagnosis is that switches don't just happen, right? Switches are triggered. And whether it's a positive trigger or a negative trigger, there's usually a reason that you switch. You don't just like randomly switch for no reason. And in our system, it kind of feels that way. It does feel like we switch a lot, first of all. Like, you know, a lot of other systems will have an alter fronting for like a few days at a time. For us, it's like a few hours. If I am out for more than a couple of days, I start to wonder what's going on, because I'm just so used to, like, we switch pretty frequently. And so that made me question, like, am I like pretending to be other people, like depending on my mood? But what I realized recently is that, like, our trauma was so integrated with our everyday life that the most mundane things can actually be triggers for us. So things that seem like they shouldn't affect us at all can actually be triggers. Like doing dishes can be a trigger, doing laundry can be a trigger, seeing a certain word can be a trigger, something happening at work can be a trigger, a certain emotion can be a trigger. And we aren't aware enough of our triggers to know exactly what is causing what switch. But it does make sense that things that would be mundane to other people and you wouldn't think would cause a switch are actually triggering for us, because like our trauma was integrated in every aspect of our life. So it could have been that something very mundane happened and then something traumatic happened attached to that mundane activity. So I think like that's why we switch so much, is because our triggers are like kind of ordinary things. Now, the big one that causes me to doubt my diagnosis all the time is the lack of amnesia that we have. And I have questioned if like maybe we're an OSDD system and that's why we don't have the amnesia, but I've been told by my therapist that no, the amnesia I get is enough, that we have DID. And I think the complication in that is like, one, our working memory transitions from one alter to the next. Typically speaking, there have been times where I've woken up and I've been like, how did I get here? What am I doing? But for the most part, it's if somebody were to switch out right now, they would probably know not just that we're filming, but what video we're filming, and they might even know where in my notes I left off, just because like that's the way that our working memory works. However, and I'm co-conscious a lot of the time, which also adds to the denial, because it's kind of like, even though I'm not the one that's actually speaking, I'm not the one moving the body, I'm still like conscious of what's going on. And so it kind of just, it feels like maybe like an alien has taken over my body, or like maybe I'm possessed and I'm watching everything happen, but I don't really have control over what's happening. And so that can be a very strange experience, because like, since I'm conscious during the activity, then I'm going to remember that it happened. And so it's hard to be like, oh, I don't find out necessarily after the fact who it was that was fronting. I just know it wasn't me, but I'll remember everything they did because I was conscious the whole time. Other times when I'm not co-conscious with the alters, sometimes I'll remember something happened, but I won't have like actual memory of it. So like, for example, Darby fronted a couple of days ago, and I know that he was calling friends and family and complaining about me because my denial was so bad a couple of days ago. Like, I was like, I don't have DID. I'm not going to listen to the voices. I'm not going to track fronts. I'm not going to sign off on Twitter over which alter is making the statement. And like, you know, I was doing all of this and all the others are laughing because as soon as they fronted, they were doing everything that I said I didn't want to do. And I had no control over it because guess what? I have DID. So he was complaining to people about it. And I know he was complaining. And I know that our friends and family told him that they know for a fact, like they've seen the signs that we have DID. But I don't remember the conversations. So like, I know the topic of the conversations and I know like the gist of what was said, but I couldn't tell you outside of that what they talked about, because I know, especially with one friend, the conversation didn't stay on that. But like, I don't necessarily remember what was said unless it gets brought up in conversation, and it'll take me a minute. And then like, it's almost like I'm going through memory files and I'm like, oh, that's what happened. And I'm able to speak on what they and Darby were talking about. So because our memory works like that, it can be very hard for me to accept that I do have amnesia, because it's not that black and white amnesia that you see, right? It's like you hear of systems where the host will come to and they're in a completely different place. They don't know how they got there. And that doesn't happen a whole lot for me. The times that it has happened have been terrifying. But for the most part, it doesn't happen that way. And so it makes me question, like, oh, do I actually have enough amnesia to say that I have DID? But I had one therapist, the first one that diagnosed us, said when we were going through the diagnostic criteria, because again, I was saying, I don't think I have this. And so we were going through the DSM, and he was like, you know, when we got to the amnesia part, he was like, see, I was like, that, I don't understand that. I don't know what normal forgetting is, because I've been forgetful my entire life. So I don't know what a normal memory looks like. And he said to me, he said, you don't remember what just happened this weekend. I'm going to say that that's more than normal forgetting. And so, you know, I've been told that my memory is bad enough that like it is actually amnesia, but as the person who's experiencing it, it's hard to see that. And then you also get the phenomenon of like amnesia about amnesia. So like somebody else might be out and they'll be doing things and I'm not there, right? And then, but by the time I come to, it's like that chunk of time just doesn't exist. So I don't know that I don't remember it, just because it's not even within my realm of consciousness. Like sometimes what will happen is I'll be like, okay, I know an altar fronted during that time, try to like think back to what that altar did, and it's like I get pushed I get gently pushed away, and then it's like, oh, we're not thinking about that anymore. And so I just forget that there's chunks of time that I have no recollection of. And I think that's probably one of the biggest things for my denial, is just a misunderstanding of how memory and amnesia works, because it's not something we talk about growing up. So I just knew growing up that I was forgetful. But I didn't know to what extent and what capacity that forgetfulness was. I guess I just like got used to kind of being a little flaky, because people would tell me things and I wouldn't remember them. So that's probably the thing that I struggle through the most. So those are some of the reasons that I've been in denial. And I know as I was talking about it, I was kind of playing devil's advocate with myself and saying why that's not a sign that I'm faking. There's other reasons that I have, that some of my friends and family have helped with, and some of the other alters have helped with, for why evidence that shows that I'm not faking the DID. So the first is, like I said, I've been diagnosed by multiple therapists. Even if it wasn't like an official on paper diagnosis, that's what they were treating me for, was DID. So I've been recognized as having DID by 3 different therapists, and which will now be a 4th, because I was going to have to drop out of therapy just because the funds aren't there. But my therapist did find somebody that takes my insurance. So hopefully in a few weeks, I'll be back in therapy. So that'll be my 4th DID specialist that I'm working with. So if I think that I know more about DID than 3 to 4 specialists, maybe I need to humble myself a little bit. Now, the other thing is, as I mentioned before, my friends and family have stated like evidence that I have DID. Like my friend I talked to yesterday was like, oh, when Veronica's out, you know it's Veronica. Because especially with that friend, Veronica doesn't mask. Veronica and V probably unmask more than any of the others. And even they will mask sometimes. But Veronica and V typically unmask when we're around people that know about our DID. And so my friend was like, oh no, when Veronica's out, you can tell it's Veronica. And she like talked about the different ways that we're different, which on one hand made me feel a certain way, because I was like, oh yeah, she's definitely more fun than I am. But in another way, it's kind of validating to know that like I'm not making this up, that other people are seeing the evidence. Another thing is, like, as I mentioned before, I do have memory gaps, even if I don't get that solid blackout amnesia. that is stereotypical of DID. I do have memory lapses, and like, for example, just the other day I had to correct a file that I had completed because whoever was out, and I was able to backtrack on Twitter and see like what had happened, and apparently I was fronting, but we were rapid switching at the time, and there was a lot of people co-fronting, and so I think like in the confusion we just like missed things in the file that were like very basic and things that I should not have missed. And then I always go back to that time a couple years ago where I was working and a little fronted and tried to do my job, and I came, like, I was out, it was either later that afternoon or the next day, and my manager sent the file back to me, and she was like, where did you get any of this information? And I tried to recreate my work and couldn't, and like ended up in tears because I didn't know how the file had gotten the way it did, and I had no memory of doing the file. And it was really frustrating and scary, and I realized that what had happened was a little head fronted and had tried to do our job. So there are moments like that I have, and even though it doesn't happen all the time, it's significant enough to impact my my work. Most definitely it can impact my relationships with people because I will forget that we've done things, or I'll forget that we've talked about things. I'm very much like if you don't remind me, or you don't like write it down for me, don't count on me remembering it, because it could be that the alter who is fronting to get the information does not relay that information down the chain, and so if somebody else is fronting, we may not remember what we were supposed to be doing. With that memory gap is the loss of skill. Like, there's definitely most of the alters in our system can at least like pretend to do our job, but there are definitely alters that like need more assistance. Like, somebody will be fronting and just staring at the computer because they have no idea what they need to do, and if Cameron's able to, usually he'll be the one that steps in, and or Brittany will sometimes step in and be like, okay, you need to do this, and this. So there is like a difference in, like, depending on who's fronting, how well we're able to do our job. Our cooking style changes depending on who's fronting. All of us can like make edible food. Some of us cannot make good food. And before I was diagnosed, it was always really frustrating because I was like, why am I able to cook sometimes, and then sometimes I make food and it's absolutely terrible? And it's just different ones of us have different skill levels. Another example, if I go even further back, is when I ran track and field in high school. I did long jump and triple jump, and I used to frustrate my coach because I was the only one whose steps were never the same, because you have to do like what's called marking your step, and that's basically from the position where you start running, like how many steps do you run and then your line for your foot to hit, not over the line but before the line to make the jump. And my steps were always changing, and now I know it's because different alters were fronting during practice and track meets, and so one person might be out to set our steps, and then we'll switch and those steps will be off because it's somebody else. So another thing is that I do experience extreme dissociation, and while not necessarily a sign that it's DID per se, it is a sign that I have a severe dissociative disorder. There are times where I am so dissociated that I can't drive. I have had to cancel plans because I have no way of leaving my house because I'm too dissociated to do so. There have been times when I've been too dissociated to cook because I'm afraid of burning myself because I'm so out of touch with reality. And I'm actually a lot more grounded ever since working with DID specialists and working through trauma. I'm a lot more grounded now than I used to be. I used to be in like this constant state of dissociation, and I didn't realize that's what it was. But like, it was normal for me to not feel connected to my body and to not feel connected to the world around me. And now I have moments where I'm grounded, but I do still get that severe dissociation. Another thing is I mentioned how I was trying to act like a singlet and not do DID things to prove to myself that I was actually just making this up and it wasn't real. And then my Twitter feed is full of alters signing off on different tweets as they switched. And what they did on that particular day, they did actually, especially when Starby fronted, he very much kept me out of the front. I think they were very angry at me and very frustrated with me about the level of denial that I had gotten to. So they were just very much like, you're just not going to be in front and we're going to continue to function as a DID system, whether you like it or not. So I do have the evidence of that, of the videos that we post that I'm like, I'm not the one that made that video. Or like, you know, even sometimes I'll look at pictures and I'll be like, that's not me. So it is helpful. I've gone back and forth on our Twitter about whether it's like kind of corny to do the sign-offs for alters to say who it is that's posting. But I've now found that that's actually helpful because one, it like shows who was fronting during that time, because I don't always know who fronted before me, or if like what happened with work the other day, if I have to go back and see like, try to retrace my steps, I can go onto Twitter and I can see if somebody posted. That means I know who fronted, and it means I know which altar to try to go to try to figure out what was going on at that time. And then the other thing is that I can hear my alters, and I have heard them for as long as I can remember. I don't remember ever being alone in my head, and I still hear them. And sometimes I don't. Sometimes it's very silent and it feels very weird. But for the most part, there's always this sort of like background chatter going on that I'm not necessarily picking up on any words or meanings or anything like that, but it's just this like white noise in the background. And then, you know, sometimes they're a lot more clear and I'm like, I'll be a thought and then somebody responds to my thought and I'm like, whoa, where'd you come from? So I definitely do hear them, and I know that, like, at least from what I understand with like schizophrenia, when you hear voices, you're actually hearing auditory voices, whereas with DID, the voices are more mental. They're more like thoughts, but you know that they're not your thoughts, and they have a different voice in so much that a thought can have a voice. It's hard to explain. So, you know, I had to sit down and I had to take a look and be like, okay, why am I in so much denial right now? Because I thought I had reached the point where I had accepted my diagnosis, and to be in such deep denial, I was like, what's going on? Why am I here? And how can I combat this? And so I started arguing like, okay, here's the reason why I'm faking it, and then combating with evidence of why that's not me faking it. And when it comes down to it, it really is that I have watched too much of other DID systems content and started to be like, oh, like have a vision of this one way that DID is supposed to look like. And that's not how DID works. It's for DID, you need to have 2 or more states of consciousness that are separate from one another. You have to have amnesia. It cannot be because of a medical reason like a brain injury or because of drugs or other substances, and it has to cause disruption in your daily life. And I meet all of that criteria, even if the way that I meet it doesn't look like the way other people meet it or the way that people say it's supposed to look. And I think that's really what it gets to, is this idea of what DID is supposed to look like. And I understand the reason for it. I understand what drives that, because like there are people that fake DID, and with the rise of TikTok, there are even more people that fake DID because it gets views. And, you know, if I didn't have DID, yeah, I think it'd be fun to role play as different people. Like that's, you know, if you're a theater kid that never got to go into drama, that's like awesome, is you get to go online and you get to pretend to be somebody else. The people that do that don't realize the depth of the disorder and the amount of pain and shame and trauma that comes with it. And when they say they have DID and they don't, it can very much invalidate other systems, first of all, it can romanticize the idea of DID and not treat it as the severe mental illness that it is, and the survival tactic that it is. It's not just a fun game to play. It is, we went through such severe trauma that our brain had to come up with a way for us to cope in order to stay alive. And it does trivialize that when people think that DID is just about being different people, and dressing up in different clothes or putting on a wig. That's not to say that if your system does that, that doesn't mean you're not valid. It's just only one way of functioning as a system. And unfortunately, that is the way that is most interesting to people. So that is what people who fake DID, that's the presentation that they fake. And so you get this flood of social media that's all like that, when in reality, not all DID systems look like that. And I have to remind myself of that. And then as a counterbalance to, the faking that's going on TikTok, you have people that are going to the complete other extreme, and they're like, if you're not sitting alone in the dark crying every day and ashamed to go outside because of your alters, and if you're not, randomly waking up in the middle of the street and you don't know how you got there and it's 3 days later, if you're not meeting all of that, then you don't actually have DID. And that is a very extreme manifestation of the disorder. And DID does exist on a spectrum. Not everybody is going to fall on either ends, and there's all this space in between of what DID can look like. And I need to remind myself of that when I allow the input from others to question my validity as a DID system. And because not only is it like invalidating myself, but I'm invalidating all of the other alters. Like, they exist, and for me to say that I'm faking it, like I'm constantly questioning their existence, and that's really hurtful for them. And it actually breaks down communication, and it blocks integration, and it is a damper in the healing cycle, because as long as I am denying it, I can't work on healing from it. So this is me reminding myself that DID does not look one specific way, and that people are going to have different experiences with their DID. And it's the criteria for DID is very like bare bones and can sometimes seem a little vague, but there's a reason that it isn't more specific, and it's because that DID systems show up in so many different ways. So I'm reminding myself of that, and if you are having issues with it, then I am reminding you of that as well. So hopefully you found this video helpful. I found it helpful. So thank you for listening to me blabber on. Until next time, take care and stay well. Bye.